Class 8th History, Chapter number 8, Women, Caste and Reform. Have you ever thought of how children lived about 200 years ago? Nowadays, most girls from middle class families go to school and often study with boys. On growing up, many of them go to colleges and universities and take up jobs after that. They have to be adults before they are legally married. According to law, they can marry anyone they like from any caste and community, and widows can remarry too. All women, like all men, can vote and stand for elections. Of course, these rights are not actually enjoyed by all. Poor people have little or no access to education, and in many families, women cannot choose their husbands. 200 years ago, things were very different. Most children were married off at an early age. Both Hindu and Muslim men could marry more than one wife. In some parts of the country, widows were praised if they chose death by burning themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands. Women who died in this manner, whether willingly or otherwise, were called sati, meaning virtuous women. Women's rights to property were also restricted. Besides, most women had virtually no access to education. In many parts of the country, people believed that if a woman was educated, she would become a widow. Differences between men and women were not the only ones in society. In most regions, people were divided along lines of caste. Brahmanas and Kshatriya considered themselves as upper castes. Others, such as traders and moneylenders, often referred to as Vaishyas, were placed after them. Then came peasants and artisans such as weavers and potters, referred to as Shudras. At the lowest rung were those who labored to keep cities and villages clean or worked at jobs that upper caste considered polluting. That is, it could lead to the loss of caste status. The upper castes also treated many of these groups at the bottom as untouchable. They were not allowed to enter temples, draw water from the wells used by the upper castes, or bath in the ponds where upper castes bathed. They were seen as inferior human beings. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, many of these norms and perceptions slowly changed. Let us see how this happened. Working towards change. From the early 19th century, we find debates and discussions about social customs and practices taking on a new character. One important reason for this was the development of new forms of communication. For the first time, books, newspapers, magazines, leaflets, and pamphlets were printed. These were far cheaper and far more accessible than the manuscripts that you have read about in class 7. Therefore, ordinary people could read these, and many of them could also write and express their ideas in their own languages. All kinds of issues, social, political, economic, and religious, could now be debated and discussed by men and sometimes by women as well. In the new cities, the discussions could reach out to a wider public and could become linked to movements for social change. These debates were often initiated by Indian reformers and reform groups. One such reformer was Raja Ram Mohan Roy, 1772 to 1833. He founded a reform association known as the Brahm Sabha, later known as the Brahm Samaj, in Calcutta. People such as Ram Mohan Roy are described as reformers because they felt that changes were necessary in society and unjust practices needed to be done away with. They thought that the best way to ensure such changes was by persuading people to give up old practices and adopt a new way of life. Ram Mohan Roy was keen to spread the knowledge of Western education in the country and bring about greater freedom and equality for women. He wrote about the way women were forced to bear the burden of domestic work, confined to the home and the kitchen, and not allowed to move out and become educated. Changing the lives of widows. Ram Mohan Roy was particularly moved by the problems widows faced in their lives. He began a campaign against the practice of sati. Ram Mohan Roy was well versed in Sanskrit, Persian, and several other Indian and European languages. He tried to show through his writings that the practice of widow burning had no sanction in ancient text. By the early 19th century, as you have read in chapter 7, many British officials had also begun to criticize Indian tradition and customs. They were therefore more than willing to listen to Ram Mohan, who was reputed to be a learned man. In 1829, sati was banned. The strategy adopted by Ram Mohan was used by later reformers as well. Whenever they wished to challenge a practice that seemed harmful, they tried to find a verse or sentence in the ancient sacred text that supported their point of view. They then suggested that the practice as it existed at present was against early tradition. For instance, one of the most famous reformers, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, used the ancient text to suggest that widows could remarry. His suggestion was adopted by British officials and a law was passed in 1856 permitting widow remarriage. Those who were against the remarriage of widows opposed Vidyasagar and even boycotted him. By the second half of the 19th century, the movement in favor of widow remarriage spread to other parts of the country. In the Telugu-speaking areas of the Madras Presidency, Veer Salingam Pantulu formed an association for widow remarriage. Around the same time, young intellectuals and reformers in Bombay pledged themselves to working for the same cause. In the north, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who founded the reform association called Arya Samaj, also supported widow remarriage. Yet, the number of widows who actually remarried remained low. Those who married were not easily accepted in society and conservative groups continued to oppose the new law. Source 1. We first tie them down to the pile. Ram Mohan Roy published many pamphlets to spread his ideas. Some of these were written as a dialogue between the advocate and critic of a traditional practice. Here is one such dialogue on sati. Advocate of sati. Women are by nature of inferior understanding, without resolution, unworthy of trust. Many of them, on the death of their husbands, become desirous of accompanying them. But to remove every chance of their trying to escape from the blazing fire, in burning them we first tie them down to the pile. Opponent of sati. When did you ever afford them a fair opportunity of exhibiting their natural capacity? How then can you accuse them of want of understanding? If after instruction in knowledge and wisdom, a person cannot comprehend or retain what has been taught him, we may consider him as deficient. But if you do not educate women, how can you see them as inferior?